Hi guys, welcome back to class. Now I mentioned something which was quite weird. I said one way of protecting yourself against bacteria is by exposing yourself. One way of protecting yourself against bacterial infection is by exposing yourself to bacteria. Well, it's actually based on the concept called hypersensitivity. Yeah, in a way, because there's something we call particularly it's more common acquired among cells of acquired immunity. So really, this is the concept here. You see, individuals who have cells of acquired immunity, and that talking about the T cells, the B cells. So we're talking about T cells as well as the B cells. Yeah, basically. So now, listen. You see that individuals who have recovered from a bacterial infection are always resistant to a second infection by that same bacteria. Now, what we're saying is that let's assume now you are down from, let's say, sore throat, for instance. Let's say you came down with a very terrible sore throat, very terrible one. You find out that the probability of you coming down with that same severe sore throat is not always there. Like in the sense that you don't have it. If you had, let's say, January, you're not likely to have it again that year. Not likely. Probably it could be after a year or two, you can then come down with that form of sore throat. Then you say something like, oh, I remember I had it some time ago. This was the drug I took and it cleared. Then in most cases, you go take that drug again, you see it clears again. Now, what I'm trying to say, the reason why there was this lapse of time, it's not as if that bacteria that caused that infection is no longer in your environment. It's not as if you don't encounter that bacteria. It's not as if the bacteria was just like, you know what, I'm vexed, I'm angry. Probably I didn't get what I want, so I'm just going to infect this guy. Then the other time, the bacteria will be like, okay, let me just leave you alone. No. You are even still cohabiting with the bacteria, but the bacteria is not going to be able to infect you again. Now, the reason why you haven't coming down with an infection after 2 years would be a reason of, let's say you were immunocompromised or let's say you were immunosuppressed due to stress, for instance. You come down again with that infection. Because there's something we call the memory T cells. Now, what do we mean by the memory T cells? They are CD4 positive. Well, you don't need to know about that. It's not from level. Memory T cells. Now, what's the function of memory T cells? Now, see, if you have previously been infected with a certain bacteria and your immune system was able to stage a response and you were able to fight off that infection, what this memory T cell does is that they kind of obtain a copy, they take a photograph of that bacteria, that specific bacteria. Because antibodies are specific. Note that. Antibodies are specific. They are specific for antigens carried by, which are presented by this microorganism. This disease caused a microorganism, in this case bacteria. So now, they take a copy, like a photocopy of that bacteria, and it is ingrained into into the cells. So when that bacteria presents itself again, there's going to be an heightened immune response, more like hypersensitivity. So when the bacteria comes into your system and it's like, okay, it's just the same as the time I came and caused havoc here, it's going to meet enough resistance because they know it, they have synthesized antibodies against it. So just the moment it enters back into the system, you have these disease-fighting proteins called antibodies, which will be produced by the B cells, the matured B cells, because these T memory cells, once they recognize this pattern, that is the antigen with the bacterial presence, once they recognize the bacteria in a nutshell, is going to trigger the T helper cells. The T helper cells will then activate the B cells. The B cells then produce this protein, disease-fighting protein called antibodies, and these antibodies will just immediately fight off this infection. So it's not going to be a case of they are trying to understand it. They know it already. So that's the reason why, and that concept is what plays out in vaccines. And that's why it's very good to take vaccines. Because vaccine is more like a cure, really, because it prevents, it's a good prophylaxis. You understand? Although it's not all conditions that, all disease conditions that have, probably the terminal ones that have vaccines, but even the coronavirus that just came out, which is still ravaging, vaccines are available. Even the new variant, Delta variant, funny enough, it even responds to the available coronavirus vaccines. So get vaccinated. So that's the principle employed with the vaccines. So that's the principle you employ in vaccines. So that's just the tweaking you do in vaccines. Because what they do in vaccines is that, okay, this is the bacteria, this is the constitutive organism. They either take a weakened form, a genetically weakened form of that constitutive organism, or they could take cells of that constitutive organism, put it in the vaccine. Now, the idea when they inject that vaccine to you is to present. They want you to be exposed to that bacteria. They want you to be exposed to that disease-causing organism. It could be virus. So we're talking about bacteria. We'll limit it to bacteria. They want you to be exposed to it. So once you're exposed to it, your immune system would have recognized it, you have seen it, and be able to synthesize antibodies against it. That's why in subsequent times, for instance, if you take the coronavirus vaccine, even if you come across the SARS-CoV-2 virus, even though whatever variant it is, even though you find it in your system, rather than it having an incubation period of 2 weeks, because that's where the immune system is still trying to stage a comeback against it. After 2 weeks, when it has incubated, it has become late, it has set run through that period of latency to then try to stage. Then that's when it now bring about those systemic presentations, and before the immune system stage a comeback to it, it's going to take time before you can eventually fight it. Although drugs can help to manage the situation before you eventually fight it. Once you have taken the vaccine, your system already recognizes it. So by the time it presents itself within the system, you fight it off immediately. That's the goal of the vaccine. So that's why we take vaccines. They are just working on that principle. Exposure to the bacteria is one way of protecting yourself against the bacteria. That is one way. So that's just the concept I wanted to explain, which is weird, but is actually an important scientific, or let's say medicine or health principle. So see you in the next class.